Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. My name is Renee Rogers, and I'm the head curator here. We are so glad to see such a great crowd of people who are super enthusiastic about Johnny Cash and this event, so thank you for being out here with us. Tonight we have a really special program for you, a presentation by journalist Gene Beley about his experience at Folsom Prison with Johnny Cash in January 1968. He was a first-hand witness to the historic and groundbreaking concerts and album recording at Folsom, and this evening we are going to hear Gene's memories and stories, see some wonderful images, and also listen to some great Johnny Cash tunes and behind-the-scenes audio clips. So some things that just aren't out there in the world very widely, so it's going to be pretty exciting. First off, I want to thank Gene for traveling here all the way from Stockton, California. We don't often have guests from all the way the other side of the country, so that's been wonderful. And this is truly making the exhibit, for those of you who've gone to see it or have seen it before, 1968, A Folsom Redemption. It's time here at the museum extra special to be able to have Gene here with us. Also, I want to give a quick thank you to my colleagues who helped make this wonderful program possible, especially Scotty Almany, who is up in the back doing all the tech stuff and hiding. He oversees our public programming, and he's done a lot of work to get Gene here. And also to our marketing team, Charlene Baker, Hank Colley, Sarah Alexander, and Ashley Linkus, who have done so much to promote and get everyone to know about this event. So that's been wonderful. Yay! A couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. If you do need to use the restroom, they are just down the hall and to the left. And if you do need to leave the event earlier before we finish, you are welcome to. We just ask that you go out the door right outside of this exit instead of going out the front doors, because the front of the museum will be locked in about 10 minutes time, and that we won't be able to go in and out that way anymore. But now let's get to the program, and I want to give you a brief introduction to our guest for the evening, Gene Beley, and then I'll hand it over to him. Gene Beley has an MS from UCLA and a BA from San Jose State College. While a student at UCLA, Beley worked at NBC TV in Burbank as a videotape coordinator and assistant to the elections unit manager. After UCLA, he went to work for the Ventura Star Free Press daily newspaper as a general assignments reporter and photographer. During his time there, he became friends with writer Ray Bradbury and singer Johnny Cash. Cash invited Dan Pausch, the chief photographer of the paper, and Beley to go to a weekend concert with him at Folsom Prison on January 13th, 1968, and that day has had a lifetime influence on Beley's life. Beley got to hang out with Johnny Cash, with June Carter, who he wasn't yet married to, the band, at many other concerts during the following 2 years. June and Johnny got married about 2 months after the Folsom Prison concerts. In more recent years, Beley became the go-to guy for media photos on Cash and sold thousands of them through the Folsom Prison Museum's gift shop. I bet you never thought that there'd be a museum at a prison, but apparently that's pretty common. Beley was also the only one who recorded the night before rehearsal of the now historic Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison concert. Sony Music made the rehearsal into a separate album and packaged it into a box set for the 50th anniversary celebration, all in 78 RPM records for collectors. You'll hear a lot more about that from Gene in a bit. Beley has also appeared in 3 Johnny Cash documentaries as a commentator on Cash's life during his redemption years of 1968 to 1969. Beley founded his own newspaper, Country News, from 1989 to 2005 in Morgan Hill, California, where he did it all. He sold the ads, wrote the articles, took the photos, and supervised the printing on a big press for the newspaper. In 2005, while waiting for his editor wife Jill to retire, Beley lived on a boat in the California Delta and finished writing his first book, Ray Bradbury, Uncensored, the only unauthorized biography of his late great mentor and author of books like Fahrenheit 451 and screenwriter for Moby Dick and It Came from Outer Space. Those are very different movies. In addition to his writing and publishing career, Beley has been an entrepreneur in the 1960s, while still a reporter-photographer, he began learning the game business with foosball tables when no one else knew what they were. When he moved from Ventura to Los Angeles to take a job as the West Coast editor for Arco's Publications, he continued this side coin-op business and began a specialty of converting aging billiard rooms and bowling centers to electronic game arcades. Beley quit Arco and never looked back from self-employment again. Beley diversified into radio-controlled show entertainment robots just before the Star Wars movie and surfed that wave with Fortune 500 type companies and department stores hiring his robots as an attention getter at trade shows, sales meetings, and special events. One of his first 5'2" fiberglass robots was sold to the Playboy Mansion for Hugh Hefner's 1980 Christmas present and was featured in the January 1981 Playboy magazine. That tells you so many things you needed to know about Gene, but most of all, it tells you that he's a good storyteller. And so you are going to hear some wonderful stories coming up. I will hand it over to him now. Thank you for being here, and he will spend some time with you in the PowerPoint, and then we will have Q&A afterwards, so be sure and start thinking up some things to ask him, maybe about that Playboy robot. Welcome, Gene.
At 82 years old, I hardly recognized that guy she was talking about. Anyhow, before I start, the actual talk of my memories with Johnny Cash, I'd kind of like to meet more of you in the audience. I was lucky I met some of you while you're touring our exhibit. So is there anyone here that's like 28 years old? I don't see. They're mostly older. Yeah, okay. Renee's father's sitting right here in front. He's the star tonight. Would any of you volunteer to tell where you're from? I'd just like to see a cross-section of maybe where you come from.
Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Can you stand up because I can't hear you.
Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Very good.
By way of Jupiter, Florida.
Okay, now, the ones that answer certain questions or stand up, at the end, be sure and see one of us, and we're going to give you a special 2 CD collection I have, okay? All right? Now when I ask you to do something, I bet, okay, can I have one more volunteer?
Definitely. Churchill, Tennessee.
Thank you. How about one more?
I'll do it. I'm from Elizabeth, and then I teach middle school, so I need resources.
Very good. Okay. Well, I really want to thank the Birthplace of Country Music for featuring our exhibit and inviting me to come here. This is the greatest honor I've had in my life. I've been at several other places in the country where they've featured our exhibits, but you're seeing the best here. I mean, they have done such a marvelous job. The lighting, just everything about it. And again, I can thank Scotty up there and Renee and the rest of the staff here. Because, this exhibit a few years ago was just a wild idea in my head. And so I want to use this as an example of how if you have dreams, you can make dreams come true. And this is my dream out here. It's really something to see it come true. I think we'll dive into my talk tonight, and the question I get asked the most is, how did you meet Johnny Cash? One night in my Ventura home, I got a call from the chief photographer of our newspaper, the Star Free Press, and saying, well, we've been invited to go to Folsom Prison with Johnny Cash. And I asked Dan, I said, well, who invited us? And he said, well, I was at this New Year's Eve party, and I met his best friend, a minister in Ventura. Well, at that time, John, being on the skids as bad as he was, he'd been arrested for going across the Mexican border with his pep pills and his guitar, and he got arrested. And our paper had written nothing but negative stories on him. And the managing editor of our paper was the one who wrote the story, so I'll tell you later how he wasn't even sure that he would run the stories that we ended up writing. But the type of stories that have been written in the newspaper before, like one was Johnny Cash races through town in his Cadillac. But my favorite was a Christmas story about how he put big 100-pound amplifiers on top of his roof in Casita Springs house, serenading the valley below. And of course he had some fans. If you guys were there, you would have probably loved it. But he had some who complained, so the sheriff pulled the plug. And the headline was something like, Johnny Cash music serenades valley, sheriff pulls plug, Cash has a blue Christmas. And then, he had moved there from Encino, California. He had bought Johnny Carson's home and casino for about $75,000, thinking he was going to be in the movies. And he was in a movie like 5 Minutes to Live, but it flopped badly. So that was just another thing. He just was having a bad time. And I think I want to show you the picture of Reverend Gressett at his Community Avenue church. This is the first time I've had to operate one of these, so bear with me. Help. Pardon? Oh, that's right. I got it pointed at Scotty up there. And I just hit the right switch, right? Right one. Oh, this was his house I was talking about, right outside of Ventura and Casita Springs. And this is Reverend Gressett. And let me tell you a little bit about Reverend Gressett. His hobby was ministering to the prisoners in California. And so when he was at Folsom prison, the prison DJ, the inmate prison DJ, asked him if he could get John back at Folsom prison. So there's a lot of things behind the scenes that made this happen. And I think, Reverend Gressett was really a key part of it. When John moved to the Ventura area, Reverend Gressett asked him if he would join his church, and he did. He says, I can't be there all the time. But anyhow, they became fishing buddies, and that's, all the experiences I had with Johnny Cash, I owe to the preacher there. And he became known as the cowboy preacher, too. Let's see if I can get you another. Oh, I forgot to push this one. This is the Rolleiflex camera that I used back then. Some of the people may remember that. It was my favorite camera because, say if there was a riot, I could hold it over my head. And also it had 2.25 rather large negatives versus the 35 millimeter cameras were coming in about that time. And this preceded, I don't know, you remember the old big Graflex press cameras? You would, right? And I always remember asking one guy that's continued to use that, I said, why do you use that big camera? He says, because when I go to a football game, they know I'm the press. When I met Reverend Gressett, he said that John and June were going to be at his parents' home at a trailer park near where that house that I showed you. It was just up the road a little bit from that house. So I was told to meet them there on a certain day, about 3 days before the concert. So when I first got there, he wasn't there. He and June weren't there. They had taken a walk on a country road. So the first time I saw Johnny Cash and June Carter, they were coming on back to the trailer park on this country road. And that's when I felt like a teenage fanboy. I just kind of melted. It just looked like they'd stepped off a movie screen. And he was wearing a blue blazer and a turtleneck sweater. And so I thought, how am I going to handle this assignment? So I decided the strategy would be to just treat him like an uncle and a family member there. So I asked him if he'd be willing to swing his nephew in the backyard. No problem. So that's how I started my career with Johnny Cash. And when after that, then I had him arm wrestle his nephew at the kitchen table. And let's see if I can show you that one. Well, this is when he was swinging. And here's my favorite picture. Unfortunately, it didn't come to the exhibit. I've been telling the staff here, maybe they can still get it. But if you look closely, and this is what I find interesting about photography, is after 50 years later, if you look up in the corner of the calendar, January, that becomes rather important and an interesting detail. One of the problems I had on that assignment, and I'm almost ashamed to admit it now, I didn't take any photos of June Carter, because I had the problem that as a reporter for the local Ventura newspaper, I knew our Ventura Star-Free Press newspaper would not want to publish photos of June Carter because a divorce had just been completed in 1966, and his ex-wife Vivian and his 4 daughters still lived in the same house within our newspaper circulation area. And the 4 Cash girls went to a Catholic school where our city editor's son was in one of the classes with him. So that's the reason I didn't take any photos of you got to realize the era then in the 60s. They wouldn't have accepted any of them. Cash turned out to be the opposite of his image, dressed in that turtleneck sweater and blue blazer. And I asked him, after I took those pictures of him swinging his nephew and arm wrestling his nephew at the kitchen table there. Sometimes us photographers just get lucky with that January calendar in the background, for example. And I just didn't know that it would add a historical note, decades later. And that photo, this photo here, has been in an international brown trout calendar that they made into a whole Johnny Cash calendar that year. And I give all the credit for my scoring that with my granddaughter, who had picked up a Johnny Cash calendar at a Walmart store. I should have paid her a commission. And she'll remind me that now. I suppose it's being videoed, so I'm sunk. She'll remind me that I owe her money. Next, I worked at getting a good family photo. Oop. How do I back that up, Scotty? That one? Okay, good. This may be one of the best family photos ever taken. And the woman there is his sister, Reba Hancock, who was his business manager. She's just a lovely lady. And I had another photo of John with his mother holding a Johnny Cash album. But at one talk I gave, people started laughing. And I couldn't figure out why they were laughing, but someone said, well, it looked like she was the boss. So I don't know, so I chose not to use that tonight. So the next photo, I wanted to show you how our PSA Airlines ticket was only $32 for the ticket. And that's how us lowly paid reporters could afford to go on adventures like this. Now, I'd like to stuff all of you in a time machine and go backwards in time to that January 12th, 1968 time that have all of you on that flight. The first thing I learned about John is he was always writing on a yellow tablet while aboard this PSA airline flight. The day we got on the flight from Los Angeles, he was wearing the same white turtleneck sweater with his blue blazer, and June wore her hair pulled back in a bun and wore a bright red coat over her blue dress. When we arrived in Sacramento that day, when June stepped off the plane, I'll never forget, she said, "Wow, it's a huckleberry picking day." I just loved to listen to her southern drawl and upbeat voice combined with a beautiful smile that inspired millions of people worldwide. Did you know she once dated Elvis Presley? Well, your crowd here geographically, I probably do, everyone knows. I'll give you all kinds of trivia facts tonight, and that at that time she was really more famous than Johnny Cash because, as all of you know, living in this area, she was from the Carter family that founded country music. Of course, this is an unusual audience that I'm probably repeating all the facts you already know, but it was a great honor later to meet her sisters and mother, Maybelle Carter. And I actually got to do a short interview with Maybelle Carter a year later in Anaheim. When we got in line at the Sacramento Executive Airport to get a ride to the El Rancho Motel in West Sacramento, no one recognized the two country western or country music stars. And I recall how some people got moved up in line, and I now realize there were probably some politicians who were really the big stars in the Sacramento capital area that got the preferential treatment. Finally, we got a black limousine and headed for the El Rancho Motel in West Sacramento. Interestingly enough, that motel has been converted into a Buddhist retreat. It's kitty corner from the West Sacramento City Hall. If you ever go there, you might want to peek over the gate just to see where it was. I visited several years ago, and it's like a time warp with no changes. It's really weird. Even back then, the El Rancho Motel looked like a rundown motel, so I was surprised that these stars weren't staying in a first-class hotel closer to Folsom Prison. But apparently the El Rancho Motel still had some pizzazz because the governor's ball with Ronald Reagan was held there that evening. And I'll tell you more about that later. John seemed very concerned about the rest of the band that included Carl Perkins and the Statler brothers traveling from Nashville, since it was bad weather that night with snow and ice. And he called Nashville and found out they did make it out of Nashville, and we're stuck in San Francisco. So while waiting for them to arrive, we were sitting in one of our motel rooms when Reverend Gressett said, "John, I know you've been so busy that I haven't talked to you about this demo tape. I promised a woman that you would listen to it." And he said, "What's it about?" And Reverend Gressett told him it was written and recorded by a Folsom Prison inmate in there for armed robbery. His name was Glenn Shirley. If you could just listen to it and mention somehow during the concert that you heard it, this old boy would really be happy, Reverend Gressett told him. "Anybody got a tape recorder?" John asked. I raised my hand. He said, "Go get it." It was my big old Sony reel-to-reel tape recorder I brought to hopefully do the research on our weekend assignment there. And that's when it helps to be stupid. Who else would have thought about the logistics of trying to smuggle a big old Sony reel-to-reel tape recorder into Folsom Prison with Columbia record executives standing by? And when I brought it into the room, I put the demo tape on it, and Glenn Shirley, the singer, began the song Greystone Chapel. And that's when, or here, I'm ahead of myself. So Have you got the cut on that? The audio track? Go ahead and play that.
This is Jake from Greystone Chapel. Inside the walls of prison, my body may be, but my Lord has set my soul free. There's a Greystone Chapel here in Folsom, a house of worship in this innocent. You wouldn't think God had a place in Folsom, but He saved the soul of many lost men.
When that finished, I blurted out to John, "Wow, if they ever let this guy out of prison, he'll put you out of business." And then I thought, who am I, a 28-year-old reporter telling legendary Johnny Cash, something like that. But as time went on, I think John kind of enjoyed my audacious statements. He even told a story about me at his Madison Square Garden, December 5th, 1969 appearance. He told the audience that when he told me about that he was going to go to Vietnam to entertain the troops, I asked, "Doesn't that make you a hawk?" And his reply is, "No, that doesn't make me a hawk. But if you watch the helicopters bring in the wounded boys and go into the wards and sing for them and try to do your best to cheer them up, it might make you a dove with claws." And to me, that kind of is the illustration of his great writing abilities. I mean, to think on his feet that quick. And I mean, he was a poet at heart, I think. And then after that, at the Madison Square Garden, that was his introduction to the song. Last night I had the strangest dream about getting the leaders of the world in one room and having them sign a document that there wouldn't be any more wars. Wouldn't that be great today? So he asked me to bring the tape recorder into his room so he could copy down the lyrics to be able to record it to the next day. And that picture, I was told just yesterday by one of the staffers here that when Roseanne Cash came to the exhibit, she said, "That is Dad." She picked out 2 or 3 pictures that she liked the best, and that was one of them. So that was a great compliment to our exhibit. Let's see here. The night before rehearsal was held at the El Rancho Motel. And I was the only one who recorded it, as you've been told earlier. And this is where I learned who was truly the leader of the band. And I'm going to share some of my favorite tracks from that rehearsal. So let's have cut number 3.
G and well, Harold, be quiet. Well, they're building a gallows outside my cell. I got 25 minutes to go, and the whole town's waiting just to hear me yell. I got 24 minutes to go. Well, they gave me some beans for my last meal, but 23 minutes to go. But nobody asked me how I feel. I got 22 minutes to go. Well, I sent for the governor and the whole third bunch, with 21 minutes to go. And I called up the mayor, but he's out to lunch. 20 more minutes to go. Then the sheriff said, "Boy, I wanna watch you die," with 19 minutes to go. So I laughed in his face and I spit in his eye. 18 minutes to go. about me. 8 more minutes to go. With my feet on the trap and my head in the noose. 5 more minutes to go. Won't somebody come and cut me loose? 4 more minutes to go. I can see the mountains, I can see the sky. 3 more minutes to go. And it's too dark, buddy, for a man to die. 2 more minutes to go. I can see the buzzards, I can hear the crows. 1 more minute to go. And now I'm swinging it, here I go.
I'm gonna play one more of those cuts from that night before rehearsal. Would any of you like to hear that? Okay, good. Let it rip there, Scotty. No, it's number 5.
Ride this train. Ride this train. Ride this train to Fire Ridge, Mississippi. See that? Let's do it. I gotta try it first, though. On Monday, I was arrested. On Tuesday, they locked me in a jail. On Wednesday, I was arrested. On Thursday, said guilty at the judge's gavel. Now I got stripes wrapped around my shoulder. I got chains around my feet. I got stripes wrapped around my shoulder. And them chains, they're about to drag me down. On Monday, come to see me. On the Tuesday, they caught me with a file. On the Wednesday, I got a cemetery. On the Thursday, I started with water pop. I got stripes wrapped around my shoulders. I got chains around my feet. I got stripes wrapped around my shoulders. And them chains, they're about to drag me down. I got stripes wrapped around my shoulders. I got chains around my feet. I got stripes wrapped around my shoulders. And them chains, they're about to drag me down.
I licensed the night before rehearsal to Sony Music for their 50th anniversary album. And they gave me a credit on the album, which impressed my 2 grandchildren and 3 adult children, which is definitely priceless and worth more than what Sony Music paid me. In fact, my granddaughter said, "Wow," she says, "my boyfriend is a Johnny Cash fan." And, you know, a lot of our age tend to forget that he got a lot of new younger fans in his last years of life when he did some of his last albums. But the 50th anniversary box set that they put my album in, all of these records were in 78 RPM for collectors and packaged into a box set that was released on National Record Day, April 21st, 2018. And I had requested 10 sets of those to bring with me tonight. We have a recording studio in Stockton, California. It's almost like a Nashville studio. But their printing press broke down for the labels. So we were hoping to get them here by 5 o'clock, but that failed. But anyhow, like I say, some of you tonight will get your names and addresses and be able to get you a copy of some of those. Let's switch to the next one. What's going on here? Okay, yeah. So that was the box set that I went into, and I didn't take a picture of the night before rehearsal. That's one of my failures, but that was Bob, or not Bob, but another photographer's picture from Columbia Records. And when I give these talks, I like to reveal my failures in life. A lot of people like to talk about their successes, and I tend to talk about my failures. I really grown over two big lost photo opportunities that night, at the night before rehearsal. Being a nosy reporter, when the rehearsal was going on, I peeked around. There was just a curtain there, and I rolled back the curtain, and the governor's ball was going on with Governor Reagan. And I saw Shirley Temple coming in with her husband, Charles Black, in their finest clothes, her wonderful looking gown, and he was in a tuxedo. And my first job out of San Jose State College was working to promote the opening of the Stanford Bank in Palo Alto. And Shirley Temple was on the board of directors. So that's how she knew me. And when she saw me on that side of the curtain at the El Rancho Motel ballroom, she asked, "What are you doing here?" I was definitely out of place. I said, "Oh, I'm here with Johnny Cash. Would you like to meet him?" "Oh, yeah." So that's when this starstruck Montana boy came out of me that night, and I introduced them. And I neglected to take a photo of Johnny Cash meeting Shirley Temple Black. And that was before he was really known as the Man in Black. But wouldn't that have been a great photo? So then I made the mistake of going to the men's room. And when I returned, John and everyone was saying, "Gee, Gene, Governor Reagan was just here." Another lifetime failure, big groan. I have to assume that Mr. and Mrs. Black brought Governor Reagan into the rehearsal room. Third mistake was, like I told you, not taking any photos of the rehearsal. My photo partner, Dan Pausch, had decided he wanted to go to bed early that night. And neither of us had the vision, nobody had the vision to see that it was going to be historic in any form. We just thought it was like going to a weekend county fair with Johnny Cash. Such mistakes are called experience as you go through life. In my own defense, I have the ability to make mistakes become one of the greatest learning tools in life. And I kind of preach that every place I speak to young people especially. And it doesn't matter how old you are, I think it's still valid. I'll give you another example of how Dan operated and taught me photography, and how privileged I was to have a couple of years being taught by him. One day I was in his Porsche when he was driving down the street, and he suddenly slammed on the brakes. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I saw a hummingbird." And he grabbed his camera, jumped out of the car, and he went and captured that hummingbird on Kodak, Kodachrome color slide film. After that experience, I wrote an article about Dan for Editor and Publisher magazine, and they put a headline on it that said, "The photographer who sees what others don't see." Today, Dan is alive and living in Portland, Oregon. For many years, he had a photo business, taking pictures of high school students. And he's got the majority of our photos here, and I want to point that out, that he's a star, really. I wish he could be here. And another example I remember of Dan is and there was a time when there was kind of a rage of topless women's photos being published in national magazines. I'm a little hesitant if I should even be telling you the story. But the city editor showed one of the pictures to Dan and says, "I bet you can't do one of these for our family newspaper." Well, Dan jumped on that as a challenge, and he recruited a few of the local Ventura bathing beauties out to the beach about 6 a.m. one morning. And he brought back one nude photo for the editors, but he had another with driftwood across their breast that not only got published in our family newspaper, the Ventura Star Free Press, it won second prize nationwide at the Columbia School of Journalism. So that's just an example. He was definitely one of the best newspaper photographers in the country. So now we dive into when we left on January 13th, the morning of January 13th, when we all left early from West Sacramento, and the Columbia Records hired black limousines and arrived at the California State Prison at Folsom just after 8 a.m. Prison officials met us at the bottom of the hill and asked that we be transferred to their prison, very drab, gray school bus for the rest of the ride up the hill. Statler brothers were cracking jokes. I mean, I think it was Don. He was like a comedian. He could have been a stand-up comedian if he wouldn't have been a singer. And so I just felt like a mouse in the corner, laughing at all the jokes. And at last, the medieval-like castle at its Folsom prison that opened in 1880 came into view as the bus neared the prison. That is where 93 condemned prisoners have been executed, and it almost felt like we were entering a mysterious dead zone. It was kind of a time warp world there. After we got off the bus and started walking towards the prison gate to go through security, a Columbia record executive saw me carrying that big Sony tape recorder, and he said, "You can't take that in there." And Cash spoke up and said, "Yes, he can. He's my friend and a reporter from the Ventura paper." Well, you can imagine, I was kind of shocked. I just met him 3 days before. And to me, it's a testament to his character that he stood up for this young greenhorn reporter and got me in with that tape recorder that I ended up putting on stage. And that's how it came to be. I think I remember especially when that big gate shut behind us. I thought about the many men who have walked through the same gate, never to see freedom again, and maybe even died or were hanged in that prison. Right? And here's another thing you might never have heard before. Maybe I do have one good trivia fact for you. The hanging place was right behind the stage where John performed. So that song about 20 minutes and so forth, that takes on new meaning when you know that. Once again, we started walking through the yard, and some of the prisoners started to holler, "Welcome!" And that certainly made me ease my anxiety level. And here's a photo of John and June, walking through the yard. And then we'll give you another photo. Here's Dan on the right taking pictures of John and June. And the other guys walking there is Robert Hilburn, who was the Los Angeles Times music. He became the music critic for the LA Times. And he's written a book called Johnny Cash: The Life. And I've been in touch with him frequently. I also remember when that big, excuse me, I'm repeating myself there. And as we walk through the yard, let's see if we've got another picture. Yeah, that's me right behind John there, carrying that tape recorder. And he would greet prisoners by saying, "How you doing?" And by 11 a.m., the first show started with Hugh Cherry talking to the audience of prisoners. And he introduced Carl Perkins, who warmed up the audience by singing Blue Suede Shoes. Next came the Sattler Brothers, and here is a snippet of that Hugh Cherry introduction. So let's have the audio of that, the Hugh Cherry. Now that was followed by the now famous 4 words from the star, Johnny Cash. So let's have that cut, number 21.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
The roar of the audience cheering, as you just heard, the whistling and clapping was deafening. Later, I thought about the granite walls of the prison that were made from granite that actually came from their own quarry. And I think that contributed to the unique sound. I was sitting in the audience. I'm going to pull up another photo here. Scotty, you got it? Okay. I'll continue a little bit while he gets that up. I was sitting in the audience in one of the front rows where John's father, Ray Cash, was sitting. I had never been inside a prison before that particular day, and I was stunned at how many of the prisoners looked like baby-faced men that could be your next-door neighbor. And yet, there were some Hell's Angels types there with shaved heads, broad shoulders, and big tattoos, and they looked like they'd rather kill you than shake your hand. But I wondered what would stop them from grabbing Ray Cash and myself and starting a riot. And then I looked up at the guards with their long rifle, and I felt a little bit more relaxed. I later learned that all the prisoners who attended the 2 shows that day had earned the tickets through good behavior. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So I'm going to try and point out where I'm sitting. A couple that I talked to earlier at the exhibit, raise your hand. We had a guessing contest if they could show which one was myself. Some people point to this guy, but the glasses are a dead giveaway. And this is Ray Cash here, and this is Robert Hilburn from the LA Times. And we were told not to wear Levi's, and you can tell the different dress there, the guys in the prison uniforms, and some of them are wearing caps. And you can see Ray Cash had on civilian. He went all the way with. He really in a suit. That was probably the most dressed up next to the prison officials themselves. So. I think the way that Robert Hilburn was first turned down when he suggested a freelance article to the LA Times on the Folsom Prison concert, they actually turned him down. But he was persistent, as journalists are supposed to be, and submitted it after the concert. And they not only published it, they hired him full time. So I like to use this as an example for young people on a way to get a job, even today, is just act like a bull in a china shop and be persistent. Now, I've told you how Joe Paul, our managing editor on the Star Free Press, wasn't too keen about printing my article and Dan's photos, and how he had written a lot of negative stories himself about it. And so fortunately we had a good city editor, the one I said that had one of his sons was in a class with the Cash daughters. So this is where I'd like to read a letter from that city editor, Russ Pyle. Let's see if we can get that. Okay. This told about how we were on our own time as freelancers, and that became very important when we started receiving royalties for our photos from the Associated Press and other sources. Anyhow, Russ Pyle wrote for me before he died. He said, "This is to confirm that when you and Dan attended the Folsom Prison concert with the Reverend Floyd Gressett, Johnny Cash, June Carter, and Ray Cash, you did so on your own time and at your own expense and not as an assignment for the Ventura County Star Free Press newspaper. Although I used your article and photos of the January 13, 1968 experience in the Sunday magazine, it is almost humorous in retrospect that the late Joe Paul, then managing editor, was not that keen about featuring Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison. My children were classmates of the Cash girls at Ventura's Holy Cross School, and it was interesting to see the impact of the Folsom Prison concert on Johnny Cash's career and lasting success with even the younger generations today. And this is an example when you're a writer or a photographer, learn the legal side of your business and document potentially famous photos. The late Joe Rosenthal got zip for his photo of the raising of the flag because he was an employee of the Associated Press when he took that iconic photo. There was a time when Ventura County Museum thought maybe they owned the photos at Folsom Prison when the museum inherited all the Star Free Press newspaper files. Fortunately, we had documented everything from paying for our own airline tickets like you saw to getting Russ Pyle to write me that letter before he died. So I'm very grateful to him. The highlight of my historic Folsom Prison Day experience was when Cash announced he was going to sing Glenn Shirley's song, Greystone Chapel. Inmate Shirley, they had placed him in the front seat, the front row there. So he was completely surprised when Cash announced he was going to sing his song. And he jumped out of his bench seat and his eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets, and he looked like the happiest man alive. And of course, all the other prisoners were cheering for their peer. So it was quite a moment. And Cash told him, he says, "I hope I do your song justice." As the other inmates were just whistling and screaming and stomping their feet in the glory of the moment. I suppose the guards on the catwalks were clutching their rifles a little stronger, but that's like I told you, I learned that all the prisoners at the two shows had earned those tickets through day-to-day good behavior. And after the show, Dan Pausch took pictures of Glenn Shirley with Cash, and that's in this exhibit here. You probably have seen that. And he told he told Shirley that he would send him a contract for royalties. We ate lunch at the prison and returned for the second show. A lot of people don't know that there were 2 shows that day. Columbia Records wanted the second show to make sure they had enough material for the album. As we got ready to leave that night about 10 p.m., June Carter asked me, "You know why the prisoner liked Johnny so much? They know he's been in trouble before and looks as mean as they do." They identify with him. Carl Perkins told me that day was an example of Cash's ingenuity. He takes a $1.98 tape recorder into Folsom Prison and comes out with an album. Well, of course, the price of the recorder was probably an exaggeration on Carl's part, but they certainly didn't have the luxury of a Nashville recording studio. When Robin Young at NPR and radio in Boston interviewed me, she told me they thought my original recording was better than Columbia Records. I thought that was interesting. For another trivia fact, that original tape of mine is in a metal box at the Johnny Cash Museum in Nashville now. So if you ever go there, you can ask to see that. When we got back to the West Sacramento El Rancho Hotel, producer Bob Johnson got a call from Chuck Gregory, Columbia's public relations man from Northern California, who asked, "How did it go?" "Wonderful," Bob Johnson exclaimed. "I wish you could have been here to see the expressions on all those prisoners' faces. It's going to be a great album." Now, wasn't that the understatement of the century? The next day, Dan Pausch and I hitched a ride to San Francisco with the Columbia Records photographer, Jim Marshall. Dan and I had an interview with Joe Rosenthal, who shot the raising of the flag photo that I mentioned. That was one of my another all-time great interviews that I've published in 2 national history magazines. But again, I realized that fewer people are interested in Joe Rosenthal than Johnny Cash. But it did prove that weekend that all our constellations were perfectly aligned, right? And I think my guardian angel has played a huge part in this man's life. I mean, as I get older, I don't believe in coincidences that much. All these things are more than luck. Rosenthal, though, when we interviewed him, he told us he was very upset with Johnny Cash with the hit record, The Ballad of Ira Hayes, about the drunken Indian from the Iwo Jima photo. And Hayes died of exposure after a night of heavy drinking and alcohol poisoning on January 23rd or 24th, 1955. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery on February 2nd, 1955. I later told John about how Rosenthal was angry with him, and Cash asked me for Rosenthal's phone number. And here's another failure of mine. I didn't follow up to ask Cash about that conversation. Man, I would have loved to have recorded that conversation. So I can't tell you what was said. The following 2 years, I got to hang out a lot with John and June in various California cities when they had concerts. Every time they come back to California, Reverend Gressett and I would go to these concerts and just hang out with him before and after the shows. And I also, just myself, without Gressett, I went to the Glenn Campbell TV show in Hollywood when Cash appeared on that show. I had lunch with John, June, and John Hartford, Glenn Campbell's TV sidekick, and another singer friend of mine, Barry Sadler. He was the one that had the big mega hit called The Ballad of the Green Beret. And we had lunch at the farmer's market right across the street from CBS. And my mission that day was to pitch John and have me do a biography on him. And I brought Barry along, who already had a biography on him, to help him sell the deal. And So I asked him to help me, sell the idea to Cash by explaining that I would do all the work. And Cash signed my written agreement immediately right there on the open-air restaurant table. However, after the Glenn Campbell TV show that evening, John's manager, Saul Hollef, he got really angry at both John and me for not consulting with him. He was yelling. He says, "I've already got a book deal." So I told Saul that I had been in John's corner too long to fight him on that, and all I could do is for him to ask him to recommend me as a writer. But you got to remember, I was 28-year-old, and he could choose anyone in the world. And he made a good choice. He chose the editor of Look magazine, Christopher Wren. I got a nice turn-down letter, though, from John's sister, Reba Hancock, that still hangs on my garage office wall. And with the news about how she and the family were all enjoying life in Hendersonville. And I remember John telling me when he bought the lakefront home, he says, "You'd really like it." And I almost moved to Hendersonville in 1980, but the deal fell through, and we ended up buying land south of San Jose overlooking another lake, and I called it my Tennessee Compromise. After the CBS Glenn Campbell TV show, Reverend Gressett and we continued to link up with John and June in cities like Riverside, San Bernardino, and Anaheim. And let's see if I can pull up another photo that's in the exhibit here. Again, this is one of my favorite photos. And I'll tell you a little side story is he leaned over and said, "Gene, can you take the girls to the bus?" Because he had his daughters, Tara and Cinda, with him that night. And I can't remember exactly how old they were. I think they were about 4 and 6 years old. And so then when he got done signing autographs, he wanted to go to Denny's to have a hamburger that night. And when we got to Denny's in the bus, I made another mistake. I said, "John, you're going to get you're going to get just mobbed in there." And "Yeah, probably." He says, and he threw a bunch of cash at me and says, "Okay, you buy the hamburgers." And then I thought, in later years, I've realized I missed an iconic photo of Johnny Cash, June Carter, Carl Perkins, and the band in a Denny's. I mean, I'm sure all of you remember that iconic photo of James Dean, Humphrey Bogart, and Marilyn Monroe sitting at a counter. It was a painting, actually. It wasn't a photo. But they were sitting at a diner counter. And so I missed that kind of photo by being stupid. But on the other hand, I think that's why I had a tight relationship with John, that I didn't treat him quite like other reporters. And I had a big advantage of starting the photos with taking photos of his family. And so that gave me, between that and being friends with Reverend Gressett, it helped a lot. On March 1st, 1969, I was with him in Anaheim, California, which was really a wonderful concert where it featured Marty Robbins and Marty Robbins' son, and I thought he was going to become a big star, which I guess I was wrong. But and they had the entire cast of the Carter family, and so before the concert, John asked me if I wanted to go meet. That Marty Robbins had just arrived at the motel. He says, "You want to go with me to meet him?" Oh my God, I grew up, in the high school in the 50s when Marty Robbins had a bunch of hits, and so again I was a fanboy. But it was such a fantasy. I mean, I just want to show you what a fantasy life I've had. And again, I want to have you tell your adult children and grandchildren that if they have dreams, they can make them come true. But to be prepared with education or whatever it takes, if I didn't have the master's degree, I probably wouldn't have gotten a job at the Star Free Press to meet John. I mean, it's, preparation and building a foundation early in life, I think, is what carries us through the rest of our lives. And that was the night in Anaheim on March 1st, 1969. I got to see Glenn Shirley perform with Marty Robbins and his son and the Statler brothers and the Carter family. And I was deeply disappointed in Glenn Shirley's performance. It looked like Shirley lacked the decades of stage performance that the others had over the many years. And also, I could see he was on drugs. However, Big John, always the human who cared for others, treated Shirley like family. He even served as best man and turned over his old Hickory Lakefront home in Hendersonville when Shirley married Nicky Dobbins in 2018. But all of this backfired on Cash. Unfortunately, after 13 years in the prison system, unlike Merle Haggard, Shirley did not adjust well to the outside life. He told Marshall Grant, Cash's bass player, although he loved him, he felt like taking a knife and cutting him up. That's when John fired him. In 1978, Shirley shot and killed himself at 42 years old in his trailer in California, in Gonzales, California, about 16 miles southeast of Salinas. And he's buried in Bakersfield, and Cash paid for his funeral. Cash's daughter has said, the experience with Glenn Shirley soured their father on trying to redeem prisoners and ended his prison concerts for the rest of his life. When I met up with John at an airport when I was traveling for my Android Amusement Corporation robot company, he didn't want to talk about Shirley, so I never got any more details on how he felt about it. Now, to close out the evening, I've saved the best for last. I'd like to share with you part of an interview I did with John on March 1st, 1969 in that Anaheim, in the backstage party they had to celebrate their first anniversary and John's birthday that had just happened a few days before on February 26th. This is just before he was launching his ABC TV show on the network. And my favorite yarn of all time is about how Johnny Cash discovered Irvin T. Rouse. That's ERVIN TROUSE, the author of Orange Blossom Special, which led to Cash's recording that song. So let's listen to Cash tell that story because he tells it a lot better than me. Go ahead, cut 25.
The guest for the first show is going to be, one of them is going to be Irving Rouse, the old man that wrote Orange Blossom Special. He's 65 years old, and I've got to send out all kinds of messengers to get him because he's down in the Everglades in Florida. Nobody can find him unless they got the two-way radio or radio.
You met him once, didn't you? Didn't you come backstage once? Tell me about that.
Well, when he came backstage one night and he told me he used to perform, used to sing, write. I thought he was just another, backstager. And I got to asking him what he wrote, what he sang. He said, well, I wrote Sweeter Than the Flowers. My biggest number, he said, was Orange Blossom Special. So I didn't believe him. About that time, Mother Maybelle Carter walked in, and he said, well, Maybelle, how you doing? And she said, well, Irving Rouse, of all people. It had been 25 years since he had performed. 65 years old, white-headed, his face looks like it had been whipped with a bullwhip, weather beaten. But I got him to do it in the dressing room, Orange Blossom Special. I had him do it on stage, and he just brought the house down, just tore him up. So I never forgot it. I went to a recording session. I wanted to do Orange Blossom Special, something like he did it. Didn't know where to find him to get the words, I'd never heard lyrics of the song before he did it. And so I only knew that he lived in the Everglades and hunted and trapped for a living with a bunch of Indians, and that he went out on an airboat on these swamp buggies about 50 miles out of Miami. So I called a radio station in Miami, Florida, and asked a disc jockey friend of mine if he would announce for Irving Rouse, if he was listening, to please get to a phone and call Johnny Cash in Nashville and give him the words to Orange Blossom Special. 3 hours later, he called. He had heard Cracker Jam broadcasting. He'd been listening to country music. He had heard it on the air, got in a swamp buggy, came in 50 miles, then rode a bicycle 8 miles to a telephone and called me and gave me the words to that song.
Bet you never heard that before, huh? Okay, any questions? Anybody got any questions? Can you stand up so everybody can hear?
Well, when you hear Johnny Cash talk, he always speaks very deliberately, very calmly.
Yes.
Do you like that all the time?
Yes.
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 Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, in fact, my first impression, the first thing I learned about him is he was the exact opposite of his image, and I learned he was an intellectual. Like when we were riding, say, in the limousine, or he would be reading maybe Wall Street Journal or Time Magazine, you know. And so that was a nice surprise. And then I think he liked writers because he was a writer. I mean, he had some other reporter friends in the South there. And so it wasn't any coincidence that we bonded. Anyone else? And we'll remember you for one of those sets.
I have a handful of questions. So I'll start with, did you stay in touch with Johnny Cash until his death?
I can't hear you.
Did you stay in touch with Johnny Cash until his death?
No. I'll tell you, the last time I saw him was 25 years after the Anaheim March 1st concert. I had a time I thought, if I died tomorrow, what would I be regretful for? And my youngest son, Sean, was really into music, so I thought I'd like to introduce Sean to John. And John and the band was appearing at Canocti Harbor Inn and Spa in Northern California. So I knew the manager up there, so I asked him if he could coordinate my getting together with John. And he said he was just too busy. And so I just bought the tickets and I went, again, kind of like Robert Hilburn with the bull in the china shop. So when I got there, the manager said, well, he introduced me to John's road manager, whom I'd never met before. And he said, well, there's no way I can get you together with John tonight because we're just too busy. We got to be in Orange County tomorrow morning. And there's no way, and we're doing a commercial between shows. There's no way I can get you together with him. I said, well, here's my business card. Tell John that we're going to go to the show. And 15 minutes later in the restaurant, his road manager was looking for me and said, John wants to see you. So to me, I wondered if he'd even remember me after 25 years and meeting millions of people. And that's a testament to not only his memory, but his character. So anyhow, his road manager, Lou, he said, meet us out back between the shows when we're doing the TV commercial. So when I was out there, I couldn't find my son. I could have killed him. You know? And so anyhow, I came prepared. I had a folder of photos like you see out there. And they had the area roped off where they were doing the TV commercial. And after they finished, all the crowd was yelling, Johnny for president. And I got under the rope and went up to him. I had a big hug, and I showed him the photos, and he started looking at them, and tears start to come down his eyes. He said, Gene, can I take these to the bus and show everybody else? And I said, sure, we're going to be at the show. And he says, well, I'll meet you after the next show. Then I said, can I bring my son? He says, yeah, no problem. So I accomplished my mission that night when I was able to introduce Sean to John. And my son, the first thing he said, and my wife will not like me telling this story, but first thing he said to John is, oh my gosh, I forgot my guitar. I left it at the motel. I wanted you to sign it. So after, I did get a photo of the two of them that's hanging in my office in a big poster. So again, Dad accomplished the mission. And I told my son after we got out of there, I hope this teaches you to be prepared more in life.
So another
Is
question,
that-
so you stayed in testing into the 90s, it sounds like.
No, in fact, even in Anaheim on March 1st, 1969, he said, Gene, you wouldn't believe how busy I am now. And he moved to Nashville at that time. And, so I had a business then, I had my life, and I just wasn't in a position to keep in touch with him.
So I'll
And
make
same
two more
one.
questions. So you had an appreciation for the music, I'm sure. This was around the Rick Rubin days?
That was what?
Was this around the Rick Rubin days?
I'm still not understanding you.
Were you around for the Rick Rubin recordings?
No, I had nothing to do with that. I didn't get to be in the corner on that. I wasn't a mouse in the corner on that, unfortunately, but I had businesses where I was really business and traveling around the country.
Okay, so then the other question I have, sorry, and I was fascinated by the Rick Rubin stuff, I thought it was great. Was this Reverend
Gresset.
Was he influential in other country music singers' lives, like Chris Christopherson?
Well, they called him the preacher, the country preacher, and they respected him. Carl Perkins and some of the others, and I can't tell you from there. Chris Christopherson or others might have been with him. I'm not sure.
Okay. So anyone else questions?
You're in charge now,
Gene, great presentation. I've been to a
Well,
lot of
thank
stuff
you.
here, and this is by far the best.
Well, wow,
Great stuff.
I'll tell my wife that. maybe that'll impress my wife.
One question I've got is, when you met Cash the first time at, his parents' trailer park,
Right.
what was his relationship like with his parents? Was it pretty good?
Yes, definitely. He bought that trailer park for his parents when he moved to Casita Springs and built that almost 5,000 square foot house. And probably all of you saw recently that house was it actually sold recently for something like 1.7 million, I think. And there was another well-known country singer in that area, Sheb Woolley, I think. He had remember the Purple People Eater song? So Cash and him were not only good friends, they were business partners in one small shopping center in that area. That's all I know. I don't know everything about it.
Who's next?
Okay. Yeah, be sure and note. Yeah,
You recorded the rehearsal, but you had your recorder at the concert. What happened to the tapes from the concert that you made?
that's what I told you about, that they're now at the Johnny Cash Museum. And I think,
Along with the rehearsal?
yeah, right. Because I think it was all on the same tape, but I had made a separate recording, or I had the recording studio in Stockton, do some editing, and I had that on a CD, and I gave that to Sony Music, but they checked the tape, I think, and might have taken some from the tape, I'm not sure. And I was kind of amazed that it was still good, 50 years later. Anybody else? Yes.
Is it okay if I ask a question about June?
Sure.
Okay, I was just wondering, I saw the pictures in the exhibit about her walking across the prison yard.
Yes.
And I was wondering, were the prisoners respectful to her?
Very respectful.
Oh.
Very respectful.
Wonderful.
She didn't have any problems whatsoever that day. And, of course, I'm sure all of them were glad to see a woman.
Anybody else have a question?
I do, but I'll use my teacher voice. I'm good. Do you know anything about the relationship between June and John with Vivian? Did you know anything that
there's a book out that's written by a Canadian woman that addresses a lot of that. I hate to talk anything negative about June Carter, especially in this area, but she gave a pretty bad time to Vivian. And like when at the Hollywood Bowl, when Vivian and the girls went to see John, and they were given kind of a bad time, and I don't know. I don't like to talk about that, but I'm trying to think of the name of the book by. I know what it's called. The Man Who Carried Cash. And that is one of the most detailed books I've yet read. And that woman did an excellent job as a writer. So I highly recommend that book. And, John's personal manager, Saul Holliff, he was from Canada. And do you know that he committed suicide? And by putting a bag over his head or something. And his son wrote a movie, and unfortunately, I don't think he should have done this. He started off with that scene of his father committing suicide, and he made another mistake, kind of my type of mistakes. He thought he was going all out to put it in 35 millimeter film. He spent a lot of money on it, on 35 millimeter film. And by the time he got it to where he was going to put it in the theaters, is the exact time when the theaters all switched to digital. So you can go in, in fact, you can probably access the interview I did with his son on YouTube, probably just by, I think it was entitled, Can Anyone Make a Hollywood Movie? And I've got quite a few things on Vimeo. If you just access Gene Beley / Johnny Cash, I'm sure you'll pull up quite a few things on past things I've had on Vimeo, because I took up videography at the dawn of the digital age, and in California Delta I started videoing a lot of government meetings for the Delta people there, to be their voice against big government. and I've interviewed a lot of personalities there. I enjoy that. And I've written a book on a historic community in Locke that I'm currently trying to sell, called Locke, California. It's history, people, and politics. But today you have to have a literary agent to sell it for you. You can't just send it to the publisher. And my wife has made me promise not to do a self-published book again like I did with the Ray Bradbury one, because I spent about $5,000 to publish it, and $10,000 in advertisements and traveling around the western United States. So that did not compute with my wife's good financial brain. So I'm trying to keep my word since I've got a good 60-year marriage and I wanted to continue. More?
Any other questions? Oh, just over here. And actually, I'll ask a quick question after that, too, because you told a great story in the car this morning that everyone needs to hear.
Can we turn that light off up there that's blinding me, Scott? Or switch it?
Do you know anything about Columbia's initial reaction to the Folsom prison tapes, and whether they were exuberant to record it, or whether
definitely.
Reluctant?
Oh, there was no problem once that happened. I mean, that put John back up on top. It was before the concert. They weren't sold that much. I mean, it took a lot for all that to happen. I mean, that's why Reverend Gressett was a key figure in it. And John, I showed you how he was the boss, and eventually I think the two of them are the ones that really sold it. And Bob Johnston. See, Bob Johnston had, as a producer, just come to Columbia Records, and he was doing big things, turning Columbia around at that time. And you can look that up on the internet about his career, and he's deceased now too. I feel almost like the last man standing from the Folsom prison. I mean, Dan Pausch and I are still alive, but I can't think of, and Robert Hilburn that I showed you, the author. the three of us that were there. I don't know who else is still alive that was there. Anybody else got questions? If not, we'll let Renee ask one.
Yeah, I'll throw out my question. And the reason why I want to ask it is because you mentioned that the Carters and Johnny Cash, they have connections already to this region, but Marty Stewart everyone here is a big fan of Marty Stewart. We've had him here for the festival and at the museum numerous times. We had his photography exhibit here a few years back, and you told a great story about Marty Stewart and the Carters. So do you mind to share that with the audience?
Yeah, we were on the way to a television appearance this morning. I was telling Renee about it. I was sitting in my big chair at home watching TV, and I got a call. I said, Gene, this is Marty Stewart, and I've been meaning to call you for a long time. And we had been in those 2 or 3 Johnny Cash documentaries together, but they don't film us all on a set like movies. They just interview us in separate cities, so we had not met before that. And he said that he was coming to Sacramento for a concert and invited me to be one of his guests. This is a type of thing, again, I mean, this Billings, Montana, small town boy has had these kind of fantasies. I mean, instead of being, hounding stars at concerts or something, having stars call me, I mean, that's really quite flattering, I have to admit. But anyhow, I asked him, well, Marty, would you like a tour through Folsom Prison? And he said, oh, yeah, sure. I said, well, if you don't have a felony and none of your band has felonies, I can get you in. And so I arranged through one of my friends at the Folsom Prison Museum that had been buying thousands of our Johnny Cash photos. He arranged the paperwork and cleared them so that Marty and the band were able to take a tour through Folsom Prison the day of his concert. And I was so impressed with his down-to-earth nature. And every guard he met, he invited to go to his concert that night with their spouses free. And when we got to the concert, we were given 2 tickets. I thought, what's this deal with 2 tickets? And then when the door opened, a young man says, follow me. And that was 1 ticket that got us in the green room. And Marty came in and talked for 30 minutes and, played a little bit for us and showed us his photo books. And I mean, it was very personal. And then after he got done signing autographs at night, he told me, he says, Gene, stick around. So when he finished signing autographs, he says, follow me. And so I did. I followed him, and we were walking across the stage to the green room, and I'll never forget, he says, just another day at the office. So then he gave me 2 autographed photo books, which I then used to show. We have a world-class museum in our own Stockton, California. So I showed them Marty's photo books and got his photo exhibit, transferred from Nashville to Stockton. It was only for a week or 2, but I felt that was good payback a little bit from this guy, So that's the story I told Renee.
So any further questions before we close and say a big thank you to Gene? No? Well, we have had a wonderful evening with you, so please put your hands together. This has been a truly special event for us. We're really glad that you were able to make it so across the country to be with us for a few days. And thank you all for coming out tonight and for all of your support of the museum. It really means a lot to us. A couple of things that I just wanted to let you all know of some upcoming events that you might be interested in. We only have this exhibit here for a few more weeks. The last day is October 20th, so if you didn't get a chance to visit the exhibit beforehand, or if you know of some friends or family that would be interested, please tell them to come and check out the exhibit. It is well worth it. It's full of wonderful photographs and wonderful stories, some of which you didn't get all the stories today, but you got a lot of them. We also have several other things coming up over the next month. On Tuesday, October 4th, we have our next speaker series with the Haint Mistress of Abingdon, telling spooky stories and terrifying tales for the Halloween season. We have on Saturday, October 8th, from 2 to 5 p.m., we have a general community jam. Any musicians are welcome to come and play and sing and be together in a community of music. On Thursday, October 13th at 7 p.m., we have the next Farm and Fun Time show with Sunny Sweeney and Ferd. And then on Friday, October 14th, we have the 1927 Society concert with Western Centuries. Saturday, October 22nd, 2 to 5, we have our Bluegrass Jam. So that's bluegrass music and bluegrass instruments. Saturday, October 29th, we have our Community Free Day. That is where admission to the museum is free all day long, and we do family activities in the afternoon. As I said, with the exhibit itself is only here through October 20th, and on October 20th, we will be screening Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison. That's a fictional movie, not a documentary, but a sort of schlocky B-movie about prison life in Folsom. But it is the movie that inspired Johnny Cash to write Folsom Prison Blues, which is why we wanted to show it on the last night of the exhibit. And so do come out for that. If you need to find out more about any of these events, you can find all the information on our website. Let's say thank you again to Jean.
Can you make sure that we've got the names and
Yes,
addresses of the people that participated?
Yeah, anyone who asked a question or told us where you were from, please come down and give us your name and email address, and we can get in touch with you to get those CDs to you once they actually arrive.
And we'll make sure that you get 2 CDs, one of the March 1st interview that you heard tonight, and the other was the night before rehearsal.
So, a nice bonus for being here tonight with us.